There are so many videos and articles that talk about composition, even some that talk about composition in the context of church photography. And I don't want to be redundant, so I figured that what would be helpful is if I show you practical ways of how I use composition as a church photographer. Hey everyone, I go by V Lauren on social media, but you can call me Victoria, and welcome to another episode of Witness to Glory. Over these past episodes, I've been focusing on the theme of storytelling, specifically highlighting aspects of my own experiences, but I want to dive into the more creative/technical aspects of storytelling in church photography. And one crucial aspect of photographic storytelling is composition. But I don't want to walk you through this without giving you a proper definition of what composition is. Photography literally means to draw with light. As photographers, when we see a scene, we take it as a whole. But if we were to draw that same scene, we can't draw it as a whole. We must take each element from that scene and draw it individually. And when it comes to composition, we have to look at it from the perspective of being an artist drawing a picture as opposed to a photographer taking a photo. So everything you hear about composition comes down to how you arrange the elements in your photos. Composition is really all about making intentional choices on how to position your subject, background, and foreground in relation to one another in your frame. And at the end of the day, good composition is just smart arrangement. So now that I've defined what composition is, let's look at how I compose my church photos. I hope my method for employing these different techniques gives you insight as to how you can photograph and compose your photos in your respective sanctuary. When it comes to depth, foreground, and layers, I believe that the best time to apply these composition techniques and approach is during praise and worship. So one thing that you'll notice about my work right off the bat is the depth of field. I love creating depth in my photos, and the way that I do that is by shooting with a wide aperture of around f1.8 or f2.8. It has a lot to do with the lighting of the churches that I work in. So I want to get as much light into the scene as possible. So opening my aperture allows more light in. So that's a technical part that allows me to expose better. But the creative part of using depth of field allows me to compose better. So when I'm walking around the sanctuary, especially during times of praise and worship, I don't photograph the person that is closest to me because I'm almost always using a telephoto lens. So somewhere in the range of 70 to 200. So in reality, the lens won't be able to focus on the person that is nearest to me. And that's absolutely fine because I like to look for subjects or congregants that are typically 4 or 5 people in. And so what this does is create depth. Depth is not only created by shooting wide open, but also adding elements into the foreground. By adding people who are blurred in the foreground through the use of a wide aperture, you're also applying another composition technique, which is layers. So notice the difference in photographing the person nearest to me versus the person who's 3 or 4 people away. Layers are created through the use of depth and foreground. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't photograph the person nearest to you, but if they're doing something that you deem photo worthy, try to think about how you can create depth. So remember how I said that composition is really about making intentional choices on how to position your subject, background, and foreground in relation to one another? So when it comes to photographing youth ministry, I am very intentional about the way that I compose those set of images. Anytime I'm photographing youth ministry, I like to focus on the minister or the praise and worship leader and have the kids in the foreground. The kids in the foreground help to provide context for who the preacher or praise and worship leader are ministering to. What this also does is blur the kids by using a wide aperture. So still talking about depth of field, one thing that always sticks out to me is raised hands, especially if the raised hands are in a sea of people. I go for capturing those moments, right, to create that level of depth. Now, this photo uses a variety of composition techniques. Most importantly, you'll notice that it contains 3 arms. This is a good use of rule of odds, especially in the context of church photography. Theory behind this rule is that evens can be distracting. So focus on photographing images that contain odd numerical elements. And the thing is, you're not always going to have a clear background when it comes to capturing an image like this. For example, this is a photo that I took during a women's prayer meeting, but I was really intentional about photographing the 3 women aligned as they prayed. And also my background is less blurred, so there's less depth in the photo because I had to shoot with a more narrow aperture to ensure that the 3 women were in focus. So I do think this theory has some legs in the sense that these photos work because the elements are of an odd value. So one thing I like to keep in mind of as I take photos is that these photos could be used for content. So in episode 6, titled A Guide to Intentional Photography at Church, I talked about why it's important to understand that not all of your photos are photos. In this hyper-digital era, a lot of the photos that we take becomes content. And content is different from photos because content serves a different purpose. Posting a photo on social media versus hanging a picture frame on your wall are 2 completely different things. The frame on the wall isn't being marketed to a large target audience in the way that a social media post is. And your work as a photographer could potentially be used for marketing and branding. So keeping that in mind will shape how you compose your photos. Since my work has the potential to be used for marketing and branding, especially on social media, it makes me want to compose images that utilize negative space. Negative space is about leaving space or room in your photos that is not busy. It provides breathing room. This breathing room or empty space does give you the opportunity to add text. And so this is where your image is then converted into content. Depending on the size of your church, you might be the church photographer and graphics person. So when you take photos, it's important to leave enough space for text. I typically compose my photos with a lot of that breathing room when I'm photographing somebody with a mic. It could be the pastor, elder, deacon, praise and worship leader, whomever. My thought process is that the social media team will more than likely use the photos of the pastor or praise and worship leader for the YouTube thumbnails or Reel/TikTok covers, because the people with the mics are usually the more recognizable and memorable faces from or out of the church service. These photos tend to garner more clicks because a person might not recognize an image of somebody in their congregation, especially if you're working with a larger church. But if all who were in attendance remember who led a particular praise and worship song or who preached that Sunday, they're more than likely to click on the image as opposed to the image of the congregant that maybe other people don't know. So not only do I compose these types of photos utilizing empty space, I also use the rule of thirds. Rule of thirds is a technique that I'm pretty sure we've all heard of. Since the rule of thirds evenly divides the photos into a 3x3 grid, I like to shoot off center, either leaving room to the right or left of the person. Doing that leaves a good amount of room for the sermon title or worship song. I also use a variety of angles and techniques, but we did talk about angles and positioning and shot types in the previous episode on storytelling, so I'm not going to go into that. Now, on the contrary, there are times where I don't want to have any negative space, and these images are typically of the congregation. So rather than leaving empty space, I fill it up, which is the compositional technique of filling the frame. So filling the frame doesn't leave any space for text. I normally use this technique to photograph emotive moments that show personal connection between people. So the moments where people are praying for one another or they're holding hands, I normally shoot with a telephoto lens. So I'm already working with a focal length that allows me to shoot and get those close-up shots. So what I like to do in post-processing while I'm editing is crop those images even more to fill up the frame. With the implementation of these techniques, you can demonstrate to the congregants who will most likely view these images that you revere the space and place that we're all gathered in to worship. So these are the various techniques that I regularly use when I'm capturing a Sunday service. But I don't just want to talk about techniques that I regularly employ. I do want to talk about some composition rules that I don't really have the opportunity to use as much, which are the rules of line and symmetry. Now, these composition rules I don't actively apply in my work unless I am getting architectural photos, either exterior or interior photographs of the actual church building. Now, throughout this series, I have worked with this premise that the church is not the building, it's the people. The building is just a space that is designated for the church to gather. However, it is nice to get photos of the actual building. Exterior photographs of your church are great for your church's website. Church architecture tells its own story, that when you see the architecture, you can probably guess what the denomination of the church is. You can show the history of the church through photos of the building. And recently I had the opportunity to photograph a church renovation project. When it comes to the rule of lines and symmetry, they can be easily applied to photographing the interior and exterior of the church. So I definitely like to use rule of lines and symmetry when it comes to getting a bird's eye view or an establishing shot of the interior of the church, which is usually of the sanctuary. I like to get those shots either before the event or before the church service. And then you can do a before and after shot if you get another establishing or bird's eye view photograph when it's filled to its capacity. And in the last episode, I did talk about bird's eye view and getting an establishing shot as various shot types to help you enhance your storytelling. So you can go check out the last episode. Also, at the beginning of a service, or even if I'm working with the church throughout the week when the sanctuary is empty, I love getting photographs of empty seats or empty pews. Those can actually be used as ways to invite people to come to church by saying something to the effect of, "We have a seat for you." So it's good to have these type of photos in your church's gallery or archive because one, it documents the history, and two, you never know when you might actually need some of these images. So the last rule that I want to talk about when it comes to composition in church photography is called the decisive moment. Henri Cartier-Bresson said, "Your eye must see a composition or an expression that life itself offers you. And you must know with intuition when to click the camera." I feel like this last rule gets to the heart of what we do as church photographers. People would ask me, how do I compose my photos? And my answer is, when you see it, you know it. Although these rules can be applied to many other disciplines of photography, church photography, I think, is different. Because even though there are times where I intuitively see the moment and I know it's a good moment to capture, I don't. Because church photography can't just be intuitive or creative. It has to be spiritually led. There needs to be a reliance and dependence on the Holy Spirit, especially to give you wisdom and discernment as you're going around documenting His church. We wouldn't be able to be here nor do what we do if it wasn't for the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives. And what we do is for His glory. We can't glorify Him without Him. So we need a Lord in all things, especially if we are to be witnesses to glory.